Victories dearly purchased and fruitless, unheard of disasters, the destruction of the finest army which France ever possessed. Such were the results of this fatal expedition to Russia. How wide a field was thrown open to accusations, to complaints, and to the expressions of regret of even the best disposed party in the nation of our allies, the Poles. Many people have been pleased to describe Napoleon's confidences delivered at St. Helena as ingenuous and tempting fictions intended to deceive his contemporaries and posterity. May I be allowed to oppose to these severe judgments the following extract from Napoleon's memoirs? It is a resume of his plans and of his conduct at this most important epoch in his reign, which, in my opinion, is as sincere as it is free from boasting. The history of the Russian campaign will never be well known because the Russians either do not write or write with no regard for truth, and because the French have been seized with a fine frenzy for dishonoring and discrediting their own glory. The war with Russia became the necessary consequence of the continental system on the day on which the Emperor Alexander violated the conventions of Tilsit and of Erfurt, but a consideration of far greater import influenced Napoleon and decided him. The French Empire, which he had created with so many victories, would inevitably be dismembered at his death, and the scepter of Europe would pass into the hands of a czar. Did he not throw the Russians back onto the farther side of the Borysines and reestablish the throne of Poland, the empire's natural barrier? In 1812, Austria, Prussia, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy marched under the eagles of France. Was Napoleon not obliged to think that the moment had come for consolidating the immense edifice which he had erected, but on the summit of which Russia would weigh with all the weight of her power as long as she was able at pleasure to march her numerous armies to the outer? Alexander was young and full of strength like his empire. It was to be presumed that he would survive Napoleon. All the secret of the war is there. No personal feeling weighed in the matter, as certain writers have alleged. The Russian campaign is the most glorious, the most difficult, and one of the fullest of honor for the Gauls, of which either ancient or modern history makes mention. This war should have been one of the most popular of modern times. It was a war of common sense and true interests. It was a war for the repose and security of all. It was conservative, European, and continental. Its success was to consecrate combinations which would have caused the dangers of the times to disappear, yielding a quiet future in their place. And ambition had no place in my views. Could one believe that it was there, that I was to fail and to meet with ruin? Never had I acted better, never had I better deserved. But as if opinion also were subject to epidemics, lo, in one moment there was but one outcry, one feeling against me. I was proclaimed the tyrant of the kings. I, who had given them a lease of life, I was no longer anything more than the destroyer of rights of the nations. I, who had done all and was about to undertake all for them. And the peoples and the kings, these irreconcilable enemies, allied themselves, concerted in conspiracy against me. No account was taken of all the acts of my life. I knew very well that the opinion of the people would come back to my side with victory, but I failed to secure victory and found myself crushed. Such are men, and such is my history. But the people and the kings, and perhaps both together, will regret me, and my memory will be sufficiently avenged for the injustice which has been done to my person. After having described the great advantages of Russia's position with regard to Europe, Napoleon adds, one cannot refrain from shuddering at the thought of such a mass of men, which one can attack neither on the flank nor on the rear, pouring out with impunity upon you, flooding all of its triumph, or retreating into the midst of its icy regions, into the bosom of devastation and death, which are its reserves. If defeated, ready to reappear again if needs be. Have we not here the Hydra's head, the Antaeus of the fable, which cannot be vanquished except by seizing its body to body and smothering it in one's arms? but where to find the Hercules. It appertained to us alone to dare to assume that part. Was it, however, the efforts only of the Russians which annihilated me? No. It was a capital burned down in spite of the inhabitants and by means of foreign intrigues. It was a winter, a frost, whose sudden appearance and excessive rigor were phenomenal. It was the false maneuvers, the counter-marches of the Austrian corps, false reports, low intrigues, treachery, stupidity, and many other things, in one word, which will be known one day, perhaps, and will be able to extenuate the one clumsy fault in diplomacy and in war, which can be justly laid to my charge, namely having undertaken such an enterprise in leaving on my flanks, which soon became my rear, 2 cabinets of which I was not the master, and 2 allied armies which the slightest reverse would transform into enemies. And in conclusion on this point, and indeed to cancel all that I have said by one word, this famous war, this audacious enterprise, were never desired by me. I had no wish to fight. Alexander had no wish to fight either. But once face to face, circumstances drove us one against the other, and fatality did the rest. Napoleon was right in saying that he did not wish to make war on Russia in 1812 and that he did all he could to avoid it. His first need was to finish the war in Spain. The conferences, the explanations which the emperor had with his ministers and with persons who were best acquainted with the Russian Empire are sufficient proofs of his anxiety. When the indispensable necessity of taking steps was made clear to him, and when his mind was firmly made up and he had assumed its entire responsibility, he considered it superfluous to enter upon any controversy on this point. When, on the contrary, he had reasons for hesitation, he would sound the opinions of competent persons, either directly or indirectly. He would put forward paradoxical proposals in his conversations and would provoke arguments destined either to enlighten him or confirm him in the resolution which in his eyes seemed the best, or to modify it or even to abandon its execution. He would then weigh the pros and cons in his heart of hearts and never took any serious resolutions without having thought them over for a long time and with the deepest attention. In the midst of his meditations, I often heard Napoleon characterize his position with this expression to which he gave vent in the silence of his cabinet. The bow is overstretched. Who had created the situation? Did it depend on him alone to slacken his bow? I am aware of all that might be said on this great question, but I cannot discuss it here. It was opined that Napoleon's dictatorship had lasted too long a time. Does not the exclamation which I have referred to above prove that Napoleon, more than anybody else, understood the danger this situation implied? The situation in which the gravity of circumstances placed France at that time did not diminish the emperor's courage, but brought out all the vigor of his mind, giving new food to his energetic activity. His first care was to inform himself on what had happened in Paris at the time of the Malaise, audacious conspiracy. Napoleon feared the misfortunes of every kind for which his death might give the signal. He blamed the hastiness of the judgment which had been pronounced on the authors of the conspiracy, and especially on those who had been implicated in it, but feeling how imperatively necessary it was to recall the civil magistrates to a rigorous observance of their duties, Napoleon pronounced, although with regret, the dismissal of the prefect of the Seine for yielding with too great ease to Malaise declarations and injunctions. The emperor received the principal corporations of the state in solemn audience. The Senate encouraged an expression of a wish to which Napoleon had not answered in an explicit manner, spoke of the advisability of proceeding to the coronation of the King of Rome. Arrangements were even projected for the eventuality of a coronation of the Empress and of her son, but there were things of greater urgency to be performed, and for the time being, the project in question was not carried into effect. The former King Louis of Holland, who was living in absolute retirement in Graz, on hearing the news of the disasters which had befallen the French army in the Russian campaign and the return of the emperor to France, wrote to him to ask to be allowed to return to Holland. King Louis thought the moment a favorable one for re-establishing the French dynasty in the Low Country, and considered that Napoleon ought not to hesitate to replace him on the throne, which was about to become a prey to the Allied forces. Napoleon answered his brother's letter by asking him to come to Paris, where he said he would find not an offended brother, but a father who had brought him up. He further declared to him that Holland had become French, and that Louis, having of his free will abdicated his crown, could not think of taking it back again. The ex-king of Holland made another fruitless application with the same object in view to the Congress of Prague at a later period. He left the Austrian states at that time and withdrew to Switzerland so as to be in a more favorable position for following the course of events. The emperor's first care was the reorganization of the army, and he worked without respite to repair its losses. He met with a goodwill and an ardor in the country, which powerfully seconded his efforts in the accomplishment of this great task. Old and new France and Italy seemed to have renewed their strength in the terrible days of the calamities of the last campaign. Just as after the Battle of Cannae, the Roman Senate went to meet Varro to thank him for not having despaired of the safety of the Republic, the city of Paris. All of the provinces of the empire made haste to sacrifices of all kinds, convinced as they were that Napoleon was more than ever necessary to France, and that they had lost nothing since he remained to them, armed with all his energy. The speeches which were addressed to him, the letters which were written to him, the addresses which were presented to him were proofs of the sincere and spontaneous expression of the feelings of the country. The artillery, both in men and material, as well as other military branches, were reorganized and completed, and very soon. In one word, the French army was once more in a position to present itself afresh on the field of battle, as numerous as it was as before its disaster. 3 months had sufficed to obtain these prodigious results. The young soldiers who, for the most part, had been employed to reinforce the army were as brave and as formidable in the face of the enemy as our veterans after a day's fighting. Unfortunately, they were not inured to fate like the latter, nor as accustomed to forced marches as were their seniors. It will be remembered that Napoleon used to say that it was chiefly with his soldiers' legs that he waged war. Wishing to attach to the fate of the empire the young gentlemen belonging to old families whom laziness and discontent had cast into the ranks of the adversaries of the imperial regime, Napoleon created regiments of guards of honor in which the privates had the prospect of becoming officers with 1 year's service. His object was to avoid leaving behind him any elements of disturbance and at the same time to increase his cavalry. The creation of the regiments of the guards of honor was as successful as had been desired by the emperor, and this new corps supplied the army with 10,000 excellent horsemen whose education was either complete or easily to be completed. The esprit de corps and the natural taste of the French for the profession of arms very soon aroused in these young gentlemen the love of the fatherland and of the flag. At the beginning, however, a spirit of resistance and insubordination natural enough manifested itself among these forced recruits, especially in the 1st Regiment, which was assembled at Tours under the command of General Philippe de Ségur. There had been formed in this regiment, which had been made up of young gentlemen from Brittany and the Vendée, a kind of association, the object of which was to kidnap the emperor. To obtain this result, the association counted on the hazards which might arise to approach the regiment to the sovereign's person. Louis de la Rochefoucauld, with this purpose in view, had placed himself in communication with the principal members of the association, notably with a certain Charette, who was a relation of the Vendéan general of that name. The police, informed of this intrigue, arrested and transported to Paris some of the ringleaders. The regiment was excited by their long absence, and a deputation came to ask the colonel what had been done with their comrades and imperiously demanded that they should be set free. On the firm refusal of the colonel, one of the guards of honor, whose name was de Nitumier, shot at him point blank with a pistol, which merely grazed his face, the bullet entering the collar of his coat without wounding him. This outbreak had no other consequences. The authorities satisfied themselves with the arrest of Nitumier and other young fellows who were implicated in the matter and imprisoned them at Saint-Pélagie. They were treated with indulgence. The Restoration found them in prison in 1814 and set them at liberty. The emperor had received the most disastrous news from the army in Russia. After his departure from Smorgoni, the army had continued its march to Vilna under the command of the King of Naples. The absence of Napoleon, whose presence inspired all with courage, left it exposed to new disasters. The intensity of the cold, which increased to 30 degrees below zero, completed their disorganization. On the road from Smorgoni to Vilna was strewn with corpses. With Napoleon's forethought, they collected at Vilna immense stores of every kind, besides provisions which had been brought from Königsberg and towns in Lithuania, but it was impossible to distribute these provisions with any order. Famished gangs of men rushed on the storehouses and pillaged them, so that all these immense resources, which would have revictualled and provisioned an army of 300,000 men, were wasted and lost. Vilna was in the midst of a horrible confusion. At a league from this city, a hill which was one mere ice block opposed to insurmountable obstacle to the horses and carriages, and these had to be abandoned at the foot of the hill. The army treasure was distributed amongst the soldiers, who faithfully brought back the sums which had been entrusted to them. At last, the remnants of this noble and heroic army arrived at Kovno after 6 weeks of disasters and misfortunes without parallel. They recrossed the Niemen, which 6 months earlier a splendid, large, and brilliant army had crossed. Reduced to 1/4 of its numbers, this army retreated after having suffered all kinds of misfortunes. But although the vanquished of the atrocious severity of the elements, the sentiments of honor and of loyalty have remained unshaken. Marshal Ney, the hero of this retreat, at the head of a handful of men of the rear guard, carrying a rifle like a private, forced himself over the bridge of Kovno, and was last to leave this inhospitable land. It is a poor consolation to think that this campaign had been no less disastrous to the Russians than to us. Their army had been decimated during our retreat by disasters and the rigors of the weather, from which the Russian troops had suffered as much as the French army. According to Sir Robert Wilson, English commissioner with the Russian army, more than 200,000 regulars perished there. The second capital of the Russian Empire had been totally consumed, together with immense riches, and many provinces had been devastated by the Russians themselves to make a desert around us. Whilst so many sad events were taking place, a Prussian auxiliary force commanded by General York separated itself from MacDonald's army corps and treated with the enemy. Disavowed at first by the King of Prussia, York was recompensed 2 months later by the same prince on the signing of a treaty of alliance with Russia at Breslau. Prince Schwarzenberg, who commanded the Austrian corps, after having left an open field to the Russian troops, who came to cut our way across the Berezina, evacuated the Russian territory and returned to Galicia in virtue of a convention which he had signed with the Emperor Alexander's generals. The Moniteur of June 27, 1813, reported the King of Naples' departure to his states in the following terms: "The King of Naples, being unwell, has left the command of the army, which he has handed over to the Viceroy. This latter is more accustomed to great administrations. He enjoys the Emperor's confidence." Matters were no better in Spain. King Joseph had made proposals to the courts assembled in the town of Lyon, where deputies were occupied in laying down the basis of their constitution. The successes of the French army in Aragon and Catalonia had given some weight to the proposal made by the king to recognize the fundamental clauses of this constitution. But in the meanwhile, the loss of the Battle of Salamanca, which had been fought by Marshal Marmont without waiting the reinforcements which the king was bringing to him, and the occupation of Madrid by the English general, which was a result of this serious reverse, once more modified the more conciliatory disposition of the Spaniards. The evacuation of Galicia and Andalusia, which Marshal Soult resigned himself after repeated orders, brought him back to Madrid, which the English general made haste to leave to avoid being surrounded. After having besieged Burgos, which was valiantly defended by General de Breteuil for 35 days, without any result, the English army withdrew to Salamanca, pursued by the army from Portugal, which inflicted serious losses upon it. The reunion of the French armies on the Tournai, and the command of which the king handed over Marshal Soult, gave him the hope of avenging the defeat of Salamanca. But floods of rain, which rendered the roads impassable, delayed the movements of our troops and gave the English general time to decamp. The king had entered Madrid, where he hoped to be able to maintain himself, in spite of the numerous attachments which Napoleon had withdrawn from the French army in Spain. These armies still numbered 90,000 men in the center and west of the peninsula, and 40,000 men in Aragon and Catalonia, with Marshal Suchet at their head.